Welcome to this special bonus episode of the Passive House podcast. I'm Zach Semke, Director of Passive House Accelerator, and we are pleased to be sharing a series of bonus episodes recorded at PhiusCon 2022 in Chicago. These interviews were made possible by generous support from Corp and Zola Windows. In this interview, Passive House podcast co-host Matthew Cutler-Welsh speaks with Dan Whitmore, longtime passive building trainer and Phius board member. Enjoy.
I'm here with Dan Whitmore at PhiusCon in Chicago. Great to have you here, Dan.
Very nice to be here.
You're not from this part of the world, slightly west.
All the way to the northwest corner of the U.S., Seattle, Washington.
Yeah, and been hanging out with Zach for a little while in a previous life.
Zach and I had a terrific opportunity to work together. We started working together 8 or 9 years ago. We worked together in the same office at Hammer Hand for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. So in the office at Hammer Hand, you're not on the tools?
So I was partially in project development.
Yep.
Significantly in terms of what we should build, and then I would help the teams figure out these complex passive details,
right,
how to implement them on site. So that was my I was bringing the passive house techniques to the field,
yeah,
helping figure out what should be built, what we should put on the building, helping the architects get the details that we wanted to build into the building, doing the energy modeling, working with Skylar on the energy modeling, and then just making sure we delivered the projects to the passive house.
We'll come on to that market for Passive House, but just rewinding a little bit back to how did you get into that in the first place? What was your sort of background into the building industry?
So I started in the construction world in 86, 87, somewhere back there. Tools on, carpenter, remodel. However, my real introduction to high-performance building actually started in the 70s. My parents built one of those Jimmy Carter era solar active and passive homes,
right,
buildings. So I was indoctrinated as a teenager in what
with the focus on lots of sunlight, thermal mass.
We even had a rock box in the building.
Did you? Like a trom wall?
No, the thing that was, so there was the slab and the tile and the big windows to the south.
Yeah.
They actually used, it was a functional R22 wall at the time, and code was R13.
Yeah.
There was an insulative sheathing used.
Yeah.
There was no attention paid to airtightness whatsoever.
No.
There was no ventilation consideration whatsoever than a leaky building. But there was thermal mass. There were big windows to the south. There was big windows to the west, which totally overheated the building. There was a rock box in the core of the building, though, where solar thermal panels on the roof would, there was a fan that would pump air from these solar thermal panels down through some ducting, put that energy into this literally, I think, 3 tons of small diameter rocks in a plywood box.
Yeah.
And then at night, there was another fan that would take the energy stored in these rocks. So it was not the trom wall you see. It was literally a rock box in the mechanical room filled with 3 tons of small rock.
And did it work?
Kind of.
I imagine that was kind of trial and error, right? Nobody had done the thermal calculations, because that'd be pretty hard to model.
No, it was a standard detail that people were using here in the U.S. at the time. It was definitely an experimental phase. Yeah. Did it provide more energy than the fans consumed, pushing the air during the day and then out at night? I would say it helped. Certainly it helped. Yeah. But it was able to take the edge off of the water source heat pump that was providing heating and cooling to the building.
That was pretty advanced. But you did mention overheating.
Well, not with the water source heat pump, but my parents trying to save energy would push the which the thermal mass was able to keep the peaks of the heating down a little bit, so our set point could be a little bit higher. Yeah. But we would have to retreat to the non-sunny side of the building during those hot afternoon days.
So that's a bit of a background, and so there's obviously a consciousness of trying to be efficient, but also looking at what's available from the sun. and just being conscious of the way people build and live. So has that influenced you in your professional life?
Absolutely. So when I entered the construction world, I entered with that knowledge because I saw it being built. You know, we were out there watching. We weren't doing the building outside of site cleanup.
Yeah.
But I did my science project on solar energy.
Right.
In 7th grade.
Yeah.
So with that, then when I entered the construction trades, it was like, I had that background knowledge, but it wasn't being implemented because the experiment failed, or it wasn't a priority across the industry. So but I did carry that information forward, like, hey, we could be doing this, the occasional, double stud wall here and there, these sorts of things. But for me, the light bulb went off. I ended up working for some developers in Seattle in the early aughts, so 20 years ago now.
Yeah.
And, I was building 9 houses, and it was like, here I am, 25 years later than that building we built.
Yeah.
My parents had built in Oklahoma, and I'm building notably worse than what a quarter of a century ago was being done.
Right.
It's like, no, this is not okay.
Yeah.
And so...
This is working for other people, right?
Working for other people.
Doing what you've been told to build.
Exactly. I mean, it's standard construction,
Yeah.
trying to bring an ecological viewpoint, but at the same time, I was also very interested in the politics of energy and how the politics of energy were defining the political dynamics globally, but also domestically. So, I was doing political activism over here, and then I was having my day job over here, and it was like, I need to evolve this.
Yeah.
So I started kind of looking for what was going on in the world in terms of better building.
Yep.
And tried this, looked there, but then in 2008, a friend sent me an article about Passive House, and I was like, there it is. It's a combination, because it was the narrative of, we can take the knowledge I have from construction. There's a community of people taking that knowledge and addressing political concerns regarding energy use, and environmentalists as well. So I can combine all of these components into one sort of, like we look at systems on buildings, and passive is about looking at how the systems can interweave one another.
Yeah.
Well, these are 3 of my main priorities: is building good buildings, being environmentally conscious, and addressing the political disparities in the world.
Was that the first time you'd heard of Passive House?
Yep. It was an article actually about Katrine. It was in the New York Times. It was published, I think, in 2008, about Katrine in her house in Urbana.
Right.
In the New York Times. And I was like, and a friend sent it to me, and I was like, oh, wow, this is... And then shortly thereafter, she came to give a short, brief talk that a friend in Seattle had arranged. It's kind of a slightly historical, monumental moment in Kat likes to reference to it. So we had an information session at a library in Seattle.
Yeah.
It's a little common room.
Yeah.
There literally were people hanging out of the windows to hear it.
Right.
Like there, it technically, terrible for COVID time, but a room that should have held maybe 30, there were probably 80 people.
Wow.
And it was just word of mouth caught fire, and it was like, this is so exciting moment. So got to see Katrine speak there, and then shortly after just dove in.
So it made sense immediately.
Oh, yeah.
What about the whole airtightness thing? Because that wasn't part of the experiment that you lived in.
Yeah. So I live in Washington State. I build in Washington State. Washington State is one of the regions where there's a lot of places where airtightness is seen as that's going too far. We don't need to worry about the building needs to breathe. Take all those narratives.
Yep.
Washington State was one of those sort of leading jurisdictions that said, no, actually, we need to worry about this. And there were certain people who were worrying about it as practitioners or advocates, but as a administrative jurisdiction, some of the forward-thinking people who were part of defining code were like, no, this is really important.
Yeah.
So Washington State was like one of the first places in the United States to require a blower door test.
Right.
And so it was already within the, in 2001, the conversation was already going, do we need to build an airtight building or not? And so I was coming in at a place where the market was already a little bit evolved on it.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, okay, what's going on here? So it was just, I like it. It's a really intriguing puzzle how to build a better building.
Yeah.
And when you involve a carpenter in it, who's intrigued by it, it's like, oh, I can make this. I can do this.
Right.
So that was I was coming from that direction. It's been one of the main things I brought to the various groups I've worked with over the years. Like, how do you build an airtight building? How do you detail it on I like to call it the cartoon set.
Yeah.
You detail the cartoons.
Right.
And then you give the options. You work with the people who are actually going to be interpreting that cartoons, and you say, "Oh, here's the various tools. Which one do you like?"
Yeah.
So don't just not just the person writing the cartoon.
Yeah.
They need to ask over here. They need to ask me what I like to use.
I'm sure architects appreciate being called cartoon drawers.
That's the contractor side.
Yeah. Because you draw lines all over their cartoons as well.
Yeah.
So there's the how, but what about the why? That obviously made sense to you straight away. Was that as a result of hearing Katrine, or where did the penny drop in terms of just the realization or the concept of airtightness being a good idea?
It came from it was an evolution for me. Like I heard it first and foremost as an energy answer, and that was like, okay, we need to manage our airflow in our buildings. I was very much aware of the sick building syndrome.
Yep.
And when I moved to Seattle in the late '80s, we were putting polyethylene behind our drywall.
Yeah.
And but that technique was coming from other regions, but we were told to do it.
Yeah.
And it was like kind of weird.
Yeah.
And
it makes sense for half the year, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, kind of.
It
actually makes sense for half the days of the year.
True. Yes.
Not necessarily.
That's a good point.
Consistent set of days. But so Seattle, Western Washington is an interesting market because it's very influenced by Eastern Washington, which is a very different climate.
Yeah. Right.
But the construction trades are also very influenced. So when I moved there, a lot of my coworkers were working in Alaska simultaneously, or even Japan. There's a lot of itinerant travel.
Yeah.
So the people one of the construction companies we work for, many of them would go to Alaska to do summertime construction projects.
Right.
And then come back and do the wintertime in Seattle. And so, talk about a different climate, working on the North Slope in Alaska, where you're dealing with Arctic conditions, and then coming down to the maritime conditions. But, in the trades, it's one building looks like the same from the outside and the inside, but what's in between point A and point B
makes all the difference.
So, my contract, the guy I was working for was like, we got to put poly everywhere.
Yeah.
Like, well, that's what we do in Alaska.
Which is ironic because in some ways that more extreme environment could be a bit more forgiving for something like that because you've got that more extreme.
I mean, they want that poly. Behind the drywall.
Because you need that absolute barrier.
Exactly.
Whereas if you come down to a more marine climate, you need to be a little bit more nuanced and flexible, variable with, and I think that's a really good point about the diurnal changes between night and day, literally, that you're getting a different requirements for wear vapor. And suddenly we're getting into pretty heavy building science, which can be hard to communicate to anyone, from the comic drawers to the people swinging hammers. You've been involved in education for sort of since then on this journey. Tell us a bit about that and how you go about that role of communicating the science and the concepts of Passive House.
So, I guess I love the geeky nature of figuring out why we build what we build.
Yeah.
And there's definitely some people who could care less.
Yeah.
And that's fine.
Yeah.
But there's many people, and I think that if we, I think there's a an acknowledgement that there's many people in these trades who want to know why they do what they do.
Yep.
But I don't think there's enough of a reaching out to say, hey, this is why, like setting up of a system. There's also, people in the trades, we're paid to build buildings. We're not necessarily paid for the education.
Yeah.
And we learn on it. We're in most cases, especially my experience, I didn't go to a class at any point until I found PhiusCon.
Right.
I didn't go to any trainings.
Yep.
I just learned on the job.
Yep.
And so I think there's in the U.S. at least, that's how you learn construction in many situations. There are some trade schools, there are some programs, but for the most part, in the U.S., a lot of construction workers just learn as they're going, and there's no funding, there's no resources put forward to say, hey, what do you guys want to learn? What do people want to learn?
But that's also part of the problem, right? Because if you're learning on the job, you're learning from people who are just going to teach you the way they've done something. So it just perpetuates the status quo. And you've mentioned there that there are some people who really like to geek out on stuff, others who don't. Does that mean you have to tailor your presentation and change how you present things to different people?
Well, so I obviously I like to geek out on this stuff. So when I found Passive House, I geeked out, and I went to the trainings, and I was like, wow, this is really exciting. Now I don't have to guess. I mean, there's a lot of like, oh, I think this is better. I read an article in this magazine about like, oh, somebody's doing this. I'll try it out.
Yep.
But to be able to quantify it and to be able to say, oh, not just somebody thinks it's a good idea, but I can test it.
Yeah, sure.
I guess this is that line. The folks who developed the Pretty Good House movement.
Yes.
One of the very first carpenters I ever worked with was a guy. We went to college together, and he finished, and then I left college, and I went to work with him 4 months later.
Yeah.
So he was my site super, because he was 4 months ahead of me. That's Dan Colbert, who coined the phrase, the Pretty Good House.
He was a senior guy, 4 months ahead of you.
Exactly.
Right.
And we were learning on the job together. Yeah. But so the Pretty Good House, that's the diversion moment for us. Like, Pretty Good House is about integrating knowledge that somebody else is doing and saying, oh, this is good enough.
Right.
Me, I geeked out enough that I'm like, oh, I want to sit down and analyze it. So maybe in another moment I would have been an engineer, but that wasn't going to be for me. I like to put sticks and bricks together. So with that, catering knowledge to trades, there's definitely, there's two avenues. One, showing people this is how you need to do the technique.
Yep.
And then there's another group who want to know why do we do those techniques, and then this is how you do it. And so I'm in that side, and partially because I like to create. I want to look at the puzzle, and I want to play with the cartoons. And research about what marker I should use on those cartoons. So the construction field has a wide range, and my work has been mostly focused on that group. And the sort of theoretical interpreting what the scientists and theoreticians think we should do, looking at the components out there, and then saying, okay, I can do what they want to do with this stuff. And so I've been working with Phius on their builder training program since its inception. I was one of the authors of the program. So 10 years in, our job there is to say, okay, here's how the building scientists think. This is what they're saying. We don't need to do the science, but we need to interpret their knowledge, and then we need to translate it into this is how you should build a building. Because people in that role are the ones who have to work with the architects, or the designers, or the detailers, help, and then translate to them what the folks over here want to do, what they can get to achieve those goals, but then have to turn about over here and say, this is why they wanted us to do that. So it's this kind of in between position, and that's when I was in Hammer and Hand with Zach and Skylar. That was my main role. Help detail them, and then help the guys who are people, men and women, doing the work in the field, interpret
Yeah.
And also, they were coming up with amazing ideas and concepts. It was like, no, Dan, this is a lot easier. And then it was my job to go back over here and evolve the system. It's because one thing passive community brought to the U.S. market is we can do a lot better. And so, but it's been an evolution. And that's why what really excited me was taking this concept of we've got these goals. How do we adapt our construction practices, our components we use in that practice? How do we adapt those in order to deliver these better buildings? And I could go out and source details from elsewhere in the world. I could go out and source components from elsewhere in the world. But the end goal is the same. From wherever in the world, it has a locality in order for it to be widespread. I felt it was one of my goals to interpret it into things that the folks in the field could understand and implement widely without having to learn details that happen halfway around the world.
Where do you see things going? Where would you like things to be in the next, say, 5 years?
So, one of the reasons that I'm on the Phius board, and one of the reasons I'm on the Phius board is because I was so excited in the very beginning. They were like, we want to make this building code. We want to make this standard practice. And I've also had an opportunity in the past number of years, a little bit, to help advise Washington State code actually not officials, but Washington State code committees. And they're like, Washington State, proud of itself in that it has one of the more advanced energy codes in the country, and mechanical codes and all these elements. So the code itself is moving towards where we already are.
Right.
And so a few folks, got to be in some meetings where folks were like, okay, we know by 2030 the code is going to get to what you're building right now. How do we stage this? And so my goal, here we are at end of 2022, almost 2023. My goal in 5 years is, why did we wait? So, the construction practices have evolved. I started 35 years ago. It's okay. They kind of looks the same. But things have evolved. The components we use, there was no OSB when I started. It was all It was all plywood. So many components have evolved, and styles and techniques have evolved. So it's a constant evolution. So my hope is that we'll, because of the climate crisis, because of hopefully the reinforced political will, is to move the baton forward fast.
I mean, that's kind of the holy grail, right? Getting into the building code, getting onto some of those advisory, having people in those policy-making roles, listening to people like yourself who have the science and have the experience, and whatever it ends up getting called, if it's something close to the performance of Passive House, then everyone's a winner. So,
exactly. And I know New Zealand's doing the same thing, and I know other parts of the world.
It's got to happen everywhere.
And it is a monolith. It's not a monolith. It's a massive construction industry in all of its forms. From the designers all the way to the folks in the field and all the suppliers in between. It's such a massive industry, and it's very conservative, because when something goes wrong, it's an extremely expensive
It goes wrong in a big way. And we don't want to do it wrong. So there's an incrementalism that is in some ways important. Super risk averse.
Very risk averse. And conservative in that regard.
Well, I'm hoping that events like this help bring people together, so that we don't have to feel that we're lots of separate silos working on the same problem, because it is the same problem. So it's great to be able to share knowledge and experiences. And we do, people look at ASHRAE from around the world. So as codes change and as things get influenced and standards get put in place, they do have a wider impact, which I'm really excited about, because when there's things like ASHRAE standards start to get developed around Passive House, that has a trickle-down effect or a ripple effect around the world. So. You do have potential to have a big influence.
Yeah, it's pretty. It's pretty. It's a challenging moment. It's a terrifying moment as we look at the impacts.
Yep.
As they're kind of coming to, as the impacts are mounting upon one another.
Yeah.
But it's also it's an exciting moment because people are, seems like after many years ready to actually do the hard work.
Can people find you online? Can they follow you anywhere?
I don't have, I'm old enough that social media is kind of like, is not my thing. So,
but people can find Phius. I've heard the Phius website's been mentioned a couple of times yesterday as a great, very non-scary website, for non-passive house people. So, that's probably a good place to reach out with some of the work that you're doing.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. I'm in Seattle. I'm part of Passive House Northwest. You can find me there as well.
Yep.
And meetings up there. I'll be working with Cascade Built on my own personal project, which is a 12-unit project.
Which we haven't even talked about. We'll have to do that as another interview, just talking about some projects.
Okay, but sorry I fluffed on the social media finding me, but
it's fine.
I love teaching, so you can.
People can find you.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Thanks
for your time. Appreciate it.